مرحبا بكم مشاهدينا في حوارات السياق. المفاوضات حول الاتفاق النووي مع إيران التي لم تتوصل لأي اتفاق حتى الآن تعد إحدى أعظم إخفاقات السياسة الخارجية للغرب في عام 2021. التصريحات لجاك واليس سيمونز الكاتب والباحث في شؤون الشرق الأوسط، وهو ضيفنا بالمناسبة هذا المساء. جاك، مرحبا بك.
Hello.
وصفت عملية التفاوض مع إيران بغير الكفء بشكل مؤسف، كيف ذلك؟
Yes, I was really describing the behavior and the strategy of the Americans in leading this negotiation with Iran. From the beginning, President Biden telegraphed to the world, even before he was elected, that his intention was to do a deal with Iran almost at any cost. He wrote a piece for CNN before he was elected, promising to get a deal done. Fast forward to when he was elected, and he installed Robert Malley to lead the negotiations. And he had a reputation for being really the softest of the soft when it came to Iran. And that really has informed American strategy throughout these negotiations. So the first thing that they did was to table an offer to the Iranians that was so generous that the Iranians almost didn't believe it. Once the Iranians had taken some time out and talked amongst themselves and worked out where their position was, they behaved towards the Americans as if this was their starting offer. What else can we get? Which is natural negotiation strategy. But the Americans were saying, no, that's it. That's the offer. Take it or leave it. That's all we're giving you. But the Iranians said, well, we don't believe that. What else is there to get? At that point, the Americans failed to either walk away from the table or to introduce the idea of some kind of punishment or time limit or anything like that to pressure the Iranians into taking the deal and demonstrating that the Americans meant business. And so from that point on, it entered this sort of period of month after month, that month after month went by with the Iranians thinking there must be more that we could get, and the Americans saying, no, this is it, but not walking away from the table. And this led to a lot of bad feeling on the Western side, both in terms of between the different allies, British, French, German, and American, but also within the American camp itself, leading to many arguments and much ill feeling because the Americans simply were not being strong enough with their position from day one.
قلت ليسوا أقوياء بما فيه الكفاية، أم أن روبرت مالي عازم على التوصل إلى اتفاق مع إيران مهما كانت الأثمان؟
That seems to be the case, but unfortunately, his approach seems to be offering lots of carrots but no stick, as we say in English. Lots of benefits, lots of incentives, but no negative consequences at all. And this has really been a point of great frustration to the Israelis in particular, who feel like they've got probably the most to lose out of this game. They've been lobbying the Americans consistently and determinedly to try to persuade the Americans to at least have the military option on the table. The Americans are even unwilling to do that. And look, everybody knows that this administration is very, very unlikely to authorize any military strikes on the Iranian nuclear facilities. But the scale of the Iranian nuclear program, the way it's dotted around the country, often in civilian areas, and the depth to which it's buried around the country means that in order to take it out fully, you would need to have either a ground invasion or probably the biggest air campaign since the Second World War. And for either of those options, there's only one country in the world who has the capability to carry it out, and that's the United States of America. And currently, it's not even willing to suggest it as an option, let alone consider carrying it out.
طيب، ماذا عن الأوضاع داخل فريق المفاوضين الأمريكيين؟ هل الجميع متفق مع اتجاه روبرت مالي من هذه المفاوضات؟
I think that story was really about Robert Malley and the team underneath him rather than Biden himself. Robert Malley, although there is a lot of disagreement and hostility amongst members of his team, he reports to Antony Blinken, who then reports to Joe Biden. And so Malley is able to craft the narrative of how the negotiations are going in his own words, with his own spin on it, to Blinken, who then passes on to Biden, who generally is quite distracted by domestic agenda anyway. And so the feeling I get is that the actual White House is not really aware of the depth and the extent of the problem with the negotiations and how badly they've been going so far, and so this is one of the things that's exacerbating things, because in the American camp they know something's got to change and they can't see it happening.
تحدثت عن تغير في العلاقات البريطانية الإسرائيلية، إلى أي مدى يمكن أن تدعم لندن تل أبيب فيما يتعلق بالملف النووي الإيراني؟
Well, I think the most interesting aspect of that dynamic is that Britain is now, amazingly enough, seen as closer to Israel and Israeli interests than the United States is. From the Israeli point of view, they want somebody in the negotiation room to have a little bit of backbone and to draw a harder line than Mali is currently doing. And given that the Americans aren't responding to Israeli pressure, the Israelis are finding more common ground with the United Kingdom, which at the moment is holding a harder line at the negotiation table. And the Israelis hope that it will be the UK that is able to hold America back from disaster, I suppose. And the relationship between Britain and Israel has improved vastly recently, not least because of the Abraham Accords. Before the Abraham Accords, Britain was in a position where it had to balance its friendship with Israel with concerns for relations with the Gulf states. Whereas now that the Abraham Accords has dissolved that dichotomy to a great extent, Britain's free to be more open and more vocal in its alliance with Israel without damaging its relationship with various Gulf states. We've seen that recently in terms of, we've had several high-profile visits from Israeli officials, including Naftali Bennett, the Prime Minister, Yair Lapid, the Foreign Minister, and the alternate Prime Minister, and Isaac Herzog, the President. The three most senior figures in the Israeli administration have had high-profile visits to Britain and been received very, very warmly. Britain has also signed into law a condemnation and prohibition against Hamas in its entirety, not just the military wing, but also the political wing. And there are various other indications that Britain is really more closely aligned with Israeli interests currently, certainly in terms of negotiations, than the United States.
هل يحمل عام 2022 تخفيفاً لآثار العقوبات على إيران، خصوصاً بعد تحالفاتها الأخيرة مع روسيا والصين؟ يعني ما أقصده هنا، هل فقد الغرب ورقة ضغط العقوبات؟
I think that's right. I mean, the Iranians are nothing if not adaptable. And, they've been living with sanctions for a long time. The sanctions are hitting the population rather than the rulers, which means that it's not informing policy. But at the same time, the Iranians have been pivoting towards China and towards Russia and towards the Gulf, actually, in order to fulfill their economic needs. And so Iran, is developing strong bonds with Gulf nations one by one, with the exception perhaps of the Saudis, who are holding out more firmly than the others. At the same time, having beneficial links with Russia and China and deepening and strengthening those, Iran's not in as uncomfortable place as the West would like. And so it means that the threat of sanctions is not as devastating as it was back when Obama first signed the deal.
هل تتجه هذه المفاوضات عند هذه المرحلة نحو الرضوخ لشروط إيران للتوصل للاتفاق؟
It's very difficult to say. I mean, what we can say really is that the Americans made a very generous offer right in the beginning of the negotiations, so generous that the Iranians weren't even prepared to sign it yet. I mean, it took them aback really how generous it was. And the delay that we've seen since has been down to two reasons. One is the Americans not being clear enough, not demonstrating enough that that's all there is. And also the Iranians playing for time, because the longer time goes on, the closer they're able to get to a nuclear weapon and the more leverage they will have. And the closer to being a threshold state they will be when eventually, if and when, a deal freezes their progress. So, I think in the end, sadly, the negotiations do seem to be working on Iran's terms. And if there is a deal this year, it's likely to be, I'm afraid, very beneficial to Iran, despite what the Israelis and their allies would be concerned about.
مع كل المعطيات التي ذكرت وللأمانة لا تبشر بخير، ما خيارات إسرائيل ودول الخليج الآن؟
Well, I mean, at this point, I feel like I should be able to give some kind of clear answer and positive answer, but I'm afraid that I'm struggling to find one. I mean, the negotiations have been such a mess. And from the point of view of Israel and its Gulf allies, it's a very, very difficult position to be in. Because if there isn't a realistic and reliable military option that can be taken without the United States involvement, then the only option you're left with is lobbying the states and trying to persuade the Biden administration to see things in a more realistic frame and from the point of view of Israel and the Gulf. And currently, it feels like the American administration is more concerned with rehabilitating Obama's legacy and erasing the influence of Trump than it is with the global security, particularly of the Middle East. And this is a very sorry state of affairs, and I wish there was better news. I think that the best thing we can probably hope for is that Robert Malley eventually is replaced by somebody with a more sensible point of view. I mean, look, there are many voices in the American camp which are sensible, which know how to run negotiations and which have the right priorities. Jake Sullivan is one of them. I mean, he has a much more realistic and a stronger perspective on this than Robert Malley does. So it's not impossible for Malley to be replaced by somebody who's more effective. And then we've only got to hope that there's enough negotiation left in the pipeline for a better result to be achieved. So I think that's the one note of optimism I can offer you right now.
شكرا جاك واليس سيمونز الكاتب الصحفي والباحث في شؤون الشرق الأوسط للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق. مشاهدينا شكرا على طيب المتابعة، إلى الملتقى.